Jewish and Christian scriptures, folks. This video is for anyone who either missed the very first class for the New Testament portion of the module, or for anyone who would like a refresher on that very first class, since the slides for this very first lecture of this part of the module were pretty dense, and they'll be ones that we'll refer back to over the coming weeks regularly. Likewise, the two required readings, we don't always give required readings. Sometimes we give bonus readings or just recommended extra readings. But in this case, for today's lecture, the two readings are very important and may show up on the quiz because they're both things that we'll refer to over the coming weeks together more than once. The first one is a chapter of a textbook called The New Testament, A Historical Introduction by Bart Ehrman. And it's just one chapter of it. It's called What is the New Testament? And it's 15 pages. And it's a great overview to the world behind the New Testament and how the New Testament came to be, and some controversies that we see evidence of inside the New Testament. The second required reading is actually a video. It's from the YouTube channel Religion for Breakfast, which is an excellent channel made by scholars. It's very carefully done, extremely accurate. And the video that I'd love for you all to watch is called How Did the New Testament Form?, which we will also be talking about a bit in this lecture, and will be good to have in mind throughout the rest of this module. But to start off, here is the New Testament. It's made up of 27 different books. As you learned in your reading that you're going to do the chapter review assignment on, the Bible and the New Testament are, sure, they're a book, but they're also a library of different books. So here in this picture of a library, you see the 27 official books that made it into the New Testament. Now, unlike what you've learned about the Hebrew Bible or Tanakh, the Septuagint, the Greek Orthodox version of the Old Testament, which are all a little bit different from each other, the New Testament texts are agreed upon across all of the three main branches of Christianity. Catholics, Protestants, and Orthodox Christians all have these exact 27 books in this order. They are comprised of different kinds of writing. The different kinds include letters, gospels, which is a kind of biography about Jesus, one history book, Acts, which is a kind of popular early Christian book. There are many, many books called Acts, Acts of James, Acts of Peter, Acts of Thecla. But the one that made it into the canon of the New Testament is called Acts, or Acts of the Apostles. And there is one Apocalypse, and that is the book of Revelation that finishes off the New Testament. Again, there were lots and lots of apocalypses written in this time period and before and after, but only one complete apocalypse made it into the New Testament canon, and that's the book of Revelation. When did this canon form? That is actually quite complicated. And the truth is that we don't exactly know, because it happened in different places at different times, and there were disagreements about it. But it's generally agreed that by the year 400 of the Common Era, this list that we see here of 27 books in this order was agreed upon by a lot of people and was going around. I will point out, though, that this order is not the order that the books were written in. So arranging them in this order was done for probably for various reasons. So this arrangement is itself an interpretation of these books. What do I mean by that? Well, for example, the book of Revelation was not the last one written, but it's placed as the very last book in the canon. If you're reading the canon the way we do now, you can go buy a Bible at the store and you hold in your hand one book. If you're looking at it like that, the way that the book of Revelation finishes ends up being the way the entire Bible finishes. So why would they put it at the end? Well, it's a book about the end of the world. So in one sense, it's a perfect way to end the canon. If you're thinking chronologically, it begins with Genesis, with the creation of the world, and it ends with Revelation with the end of the world. So that makes sense. But there's another thing about Revelation, which is that it ends with some a kind of curse, a curse that anyone who adds anything to this book, well, curses will be added to that person. And anyone who takes anything away from this book, well, life will be taken away from that person. So when you think about it, putting a book that ends like that into a canon sort of pushes that curse back over all of the books and starts to give people the idea that like they shouldn't change anything or add any more books or take any books away. And so over time, we see the canon as a very fixed thing in a very particular order, and we cannot mess around with it. Here is, if you are interested in learning more about how that canon came to be formed, the New Testament canon, this is the video to watch, and it's linked on Loop. What if we're sort of trying to think like historians, and we do want to think about which order the books were written in? Well, on this slide, the books are listed in the order in which they were probably written, give or take. I mean, we actually don't know exact dates. So all of this has a little bit of educated guesswork to it. But this list is the one provided by scholar Marcus Borg in his book, Evolution of the Word, the New Testament in the Order the Books Were Written. And he tries to place the books in the order that is agreed upon by the most New Testament scholars. With one exception, he does say his opinion is different on the Gospel of John and the Gospel of Luke. So he's got those flipped. Most New Testament scholars think that John was written last, but there has been a growing debate about that over the last few decades. And so Marcus Borg falls on the side of that debate that's starting to put Luke as the last gospel written. But anyway, if you look at the difference, you can see that in the canon, the gospels come first. And that makes lots of sense because they're about Jesus. And all of the New Testament books are about Jesus in one way or another. So they're about Jesus' life. So of course you want to put that first. But the truth is that the books that were written first are the epistles of Paul, the undisputed epistles or letters written by Paul that everyone agrees that he really did write. So those are written in the 50s, and they're the earliest New Testament books we have. And the Gospels didn't start to be written until around 70, 70 is Mark. The second Gospel, Matthew, is probably in the 80s. And then Luke and John, there's a debate about them, but they range from the 90s to the 100s to even 120, some people think. So we're not sure. If you have some spare time, there's a short video. It's probably less than 15 minutes long on Loop. That's a bonus reading, which is myself and my dear colleague, Tom O'Loughlin, talking about why it's important to think about the order in which the New Testament books were written and how we can see development of ideas and changes over time in how people were responding to and thinking about Jesus. So that video is fun. In a nutshell, if you asked me really quickly to answer the who, where, what, when, why, who I said who twice, of the New Testament. This is the slide that talks about those basics. So who wrote the New Testament? Well, it's very similar to what you've already learned in this module about the Hebrew Bible and about the Septuagint or Apocrypha. It's various authors, and some of them we know, like we know the Apostle Paul, who wrote lots of letters in the New Testament, and some of them we don't know. Like we actually don't know who wrote the Gospels. Those names that we give them of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were added by tradition much later. But when the first manuscripts of the Gospels don't have, they're not signed or they don't have titles or anything. So some of the authors are known, some of them are unknown. But one thing to note is most of the authors, maybe all of them, were Jewish. So the New Testament was written at a time when the Jesus followers were still part of Judaism. It was one kind of Judaism among many. Maybe the author of the Gospel of Luke is an exception to that, but so we debate that. But it's important to remember that when the books were written, following Jesus was something that one kind of Jewish person did, whereas when the New Testament was made into a canon, the movement that followed Jesus had separated out from Judaism and started to become a new world religion of Christianity. What kind of books are these? As we mentioned before, they fall into 4 different categories. Gospels, which are modeled after the Greek bios genre, which simply means sort of a life of a heroic person, a life of Jesus, life of a hero, sort of a biography, but with a positive spin for sure. Acts is sort of a history book of important deeds that kind of teach, kind of inspire the listeners to emulate a certain lifestyle. And then epistles, which is just a fancy word for letters, but there's different kinds of letters. So some of them are just actual correspondence between a person and a community. So we don't have the other letters that were written back. We just have one half of the correspondence. They're just plain old real letters that were sent. But other letters, like the later ones, are actually not really sent to a person, but they're more like a treatise written in the style of a letter, but they're actually to a general audience. And then, as I mentioned before, one apocalypse, which is a visionary picture of the end of the world and also a critique of the political situation at the time it was written. What language were they written in? They were written in Greek, ancient Greek, but a specific type of ancient Greek, Koine or common Greek. So not the very fancy Greek of somebody like Homer, fancy verse and like epic, really elaborate language. They were more written in the type of Greek that everyday people would speak in the marketplace. So the New Testament is actually a very precious treasury of examples of this common Greek language, which we don't have that many examples of, since it was mostly used for business communications and things like that. So we're very lucky as historians to have this treasure trove of writings in common Greek, Koine. There's also a little bit of Aramaic thrown in. For example, sometimes when gospel authors want to show something that Jesus said, they won't bother to translate it into Greek, but they'll just use the Aramaic that Jesus would have spoken. So Aramaic is a kind of common Hebrew that certain Jewish people, maybe more conservative Jewish people who were trying to maintain their traditions and not become Hellenistic or Roman, would have spoken. So it's interesting that Jesus would have spoken this kind of language that people who are really trying to be loyal to a maybe stricter form of Judaism would have spoken. When was the New Testament written? The earliest book was written probably around 50 or in the 50s, and the latest books were probably written 110 or 120. So the whole of the New Testament was composed between the second half of the first century and the first bit of the second century. What do they all have in common? They are very different from each other, but they are all very interested in the person of Jesus of Nazareth and his role as a Christ or deliverer, savior, Messiah, and they're all responding to him in one way or another. What got left out of the New Testament? There were lots and lots of writings happening at the time. Ever since the Hellenistic period, people were very interested in producing texts and writings, and even if most people couldn't read and couldn't write, they were still very interested in cobbling together funds to pay a scribe to be able to write down their words, or find a patron who would pay for the production of a text, which was a little bit special, precious, and expensive at the time. So surprisingly, there are a lot of early Christian writings, and the vast majority of them did not make it into the New Testament, and many of them are lost. So over those first few centuries, most early Christian writings are either lost to us, or they only come to us in little fragments, or they only come to us when somebody else is writing about them and they just mention the title and say, oh, you should not read, the Gospel of the Magi. But of course, we don't have that gospel. We just know it existed because someone is saying not to read it. So yes, there are gospels, there are acts, there are visions, apocalypses, letters, treatises, philosophy, poetry, all this kind of stuff was written by early Christians, but only certain books were selected for the canon. And those ones that were selected fall into Gospels, letters, Acts, and one Apocalypse. This is what Koine Greek looks like, but the reason I've put up two pictures here is to show you that the way we look at it now, if we look into a Greek New Testament, on the left is very easy to see and read. There are chapter divisions, there are verse divisions, there are clear titles, there's headers for different sections, there's accents, big spaces between words, punctuation, and all of that. But the picture on the right shows more like how it would have been written in antiquity, which is often there's no space between sentences or even between words, and there's no punctuation or very little, and lots of the things that we see in Bibles today, such as headers, titles, chapters, verses, all of that has been added later to help with reading, but it wasn't there in antiquity. Some connections between what we're going to be doing for the next few weeks with the New Testament and between the first part of the module that you've taken with Brad are on this slide. So for one thing, the New Testament forms a part of the Bible for virtually all Christians today, but it does not form part of the Bible for Jews. Even though each book in the New Testament was written by someone who was practicing within Judaism at the time it was written, the collection itself is a Christian collection and is not a part of a Jewish collection of sacred writings. How do we know that the people in the New Testament were practicing Judaism at the time? Well, for one thing, some of the main characters of the New Testament, like Jesus himself, or like Paul, who wrote many of the letters, they were interpreting Torah and debating Torah. It was very important to them to wrestle with how to live out the Torah or the law in their time. So that is a very common Jewish practice. Usually non-Jews don't really care about how to follow Torah. We can also see that the New Testament books are filled with quotations from, allusions to, interpretations of, an incorporation of older Jewish writings. So probably most Romans or Greeks who weren't Jews wouldn't have read these writings. But the New Testament is filled with ancient Jewish scriptures. So from the Septuagint especially. So that's another reason why we know that this was a Jewish movement. They're also full of things that Jewish people were particularly concerned about, like in the 300 or 400 years leading up to Jesus, resurrection was a very hot topic in Judaism, not so much in the rest of the ancient world. So, but resurrection is very important in the New Testament. So this is a Jewish hot topic. How to deal with non-Jews or Gentiles, how to deal with foreign non-Jewish overlords or occupiers like the Roman Empire. These are all very Jewish concerns. Also, the main reason why we know that these were Jewish authors is because Jesus is depicted as a Messiah. Well, a Messiah is a very important Jewish concept. It could mean a number of different things in antiquity, but we can see the New Testament authors are all participating in this process of figuring out, is Jesus a Messiah or the Messiah, and what kind of Messiah is he? Because there were a number of different expectations around Messianism before Jesus' time. So that's another reason why we know this was a Jewish movement at the time, because Messianism is a Jewish concept. However, the act of closing all of these New Testament writings into sort of one book or canonization has certainly worked over time to smooth the New Testament into sort of a single theological reading that is ultimately no longer Jewish, because the New World religion of Christianity was born at this time. But like your chapter, the chapter that you're doing the review on, it's very nice how it separates two different ways of thinking about sacred texts. And one of them is a devotional way, and the other one is a historical way. And these don't have to clash, but they are different. And so you can tell from this lecture that I'm really putting on a historian's hat right now. And so one thing that historians do is not take the canon as it is and read it just like one book, but instead look separately at the context behind each and every author. And when you do that, you can actually uncover tensions and disagreements even, and see that the New Testament authors were struggling and wrestling with each other as they're just figuring out, what do we think about Jesus? What does he mean to us? And what kind of Messiah are we talking about? And how should we keep Torah, or is that not for us to do anymore? And all of those tensions are really present when you think like a historian and look at each book on its own. So there would be no New Testament without Jesus. So we should focus a little bit on him today. But we all, for sure, have a huge mental picture of who Jesus was and what he was like, because in our culture, we cannot escape his major influence. However, one of the main tricks that historians do is a kind of forgetting. And so what I try to do, it's impossible to do it perfectly, but what I try to do is, say I'm looking at the beginning of the 1st century and I'm looking at Jesus, I try to forget everything that happened after that point and pretend that the only evidence I have is exactly from that time. So I need to forget what I've learned in church and forget 2,000 years of development and theological reflection and debate. And I need to only look at the evidence from that time and see what are the options for who Jesus was. And so when we do that, when we think about, okay, it's the beginning of the 1st century, it is Galilee, so sort of an agrarian peasant area with little cities all around, and then the the big well-known city of Jerusalem, a bit further away, that people would maybe go on pilgrimages to, were in the early Roman Empire. It's very, very recently has become an empire under Rome. And you're there in Galilee and you see Jesus walking around. You see, okay, it's a Jewish guy, and it seems like people come to him for healing, and they come away happy. They say, oh, this guy healed me, or this guy got rid of my demons. And then sometimes he gives speeches. People are following him around. He chooses poverty and chooses to be homeless, and instead just wanders and relies on people's generosity. So what are your options as a first century person when you see this man walking around? Well, I have a list of some of the options on this slide. One of them, I put wandering cynic philosopher. So what is that? It's a kind of philosopher that also chose voluntary poverty and itinerancy, so wandering around, saying witty things and sort of making people change their mind about stuff and poking at the status quo, and maybe gathering followers. Maybe people would have thought, oh yeah, he's like that. He's one of those wandering philosophers, one of those witty guys. Jewish teacher or rabbi. Maybe people would have seen him and thought, oh yeah, he interprets Torah. He goes around helping the everyday person figure out Torah. That's what he's doing. A dangerous criminal. Rome was in the business of so-called keeping the peace by kind of being violent. They were constantly expanding and then trying to keep their expanded empire unified, basically through threat of violence. So just do what you're told and keep it low, keep it on the down low, no troublemaking, and everything will be fine. But if you cause any kind of trouble or gather any kind of large group, the Romans would crucify first and ask questions later. So some people probably looked at Jesus walking around getting crowds of followers and thought like, uh-oh, we don't want to attract Rome's attention. We don't want them to come here and make us pay more taxes. We wish he would just be quiet. This is not good. So people may have had a negative view of him. Or a charlatan. People may have thought, oh, he's one of those guys trying to make money, giving some fake healing. Son of God. That was a phrase used of Jesus. And the reason why that's particularly interesting was because the Roman Emperor Augustus, who sort of died when Jesus was a teenager, so he would have been emperor when Jesus was born, he actually minted coins that said Augustus, son of God, which was a new move for Roman leaders and sort of established the empire, that the emperor was also son of a god, or a kind of god. So calling Jesus son of God would have been quite eye-opening, maybe a little bit considered dangerous. Savior, Messiah, deliverer, these Jewish terms is someone who would come and throw off the Romans, someone who would establish a Jewish kingdom again. That was definitely a notion going around at the time. Sage, traveling wise person, Lord, master, healer, just a traveling person who just helped people become well, or exorcist. At the time, illnesses were attributed to demons. Demons were sort of the science of the day. A toothache was a demon, a headache was a demon, a mental illness was a demon. So if someone went around and was able to cause people to experience freedom from their illnesses, they were considered a successful or an effective exorcist and healer. And that was another option at the time that people went around doing. Magician. Maybe people thought he was a magic worker. This was an option at the time. And then the one that's not written down, but that you just learned about with Brad, is prophet. And that is probably my preferred option for how people must have seen Jesus, because well, his own language seems to He sort of behaves like prophets. And we know that at the time Jewish people were lamenting a little bit that there were no more prophets. There was a notion that prophecy had ceased to happen. Of course, there wasn't an independent Jewish monarchy anymore, which was the time when the prophets really flourished. Well, I say flourished, but actually a lot of the prophets were killed by the kings and priests that they served. So Jesus was also similar to prophets in that he too was killed and was seen by many as a troublemaker. And he spoke truth. The prophets spoke truth about justice, and then they were not popular for it. And that's a similarity with Jesus too. So, and then this slide goes on to say that when we look at the New Testament text, we see that his followers and the early Jesus followers after his death, they don't exactly agree or understand who he was. It takes some centuries for early Christianity to settle and agree on the kind of Messiah that he was. Because you could be a Messiah for the whole world. You could be a Messiah for just getting rid of Rome. You could be a Messiah for the end of the world, but just for Jews. All of these options were on the table. So it's easy for us in hindsight to be like, oh yes, we know exactly what a Messiah is, but that's only because of 2,000 years of reflection, debate, writing, and all of that. This next slide, I'm not going to read it all to you because you can read it, but what it is my specialty is it's something we call historical Jesus research. So I'm a historical Jesus researcher. So that means that kind of forgetting that I talked about earlier, where you try to get rid of the biases and assumptions that you have about, in this case, Jesus, and try to look at the evidence from the time as it is, and read very closely and very carefully and look at as much of it as you can, and then see from a critical historian's perspective, what can we learn from that evidence that everyone could agree on, whether the scholar is Catholic, Jewish, atheist, Protestant, something else. If all different kinds of scholars can sort of say like, yes, we definitely agree on this evidence, what picture do they build of Jesus? And this slide is my picture as a historical Jesus specialist. This is, in my words, what most historians agree on about Jesus. It's not exactly what you would find in church, but that doesn't mean it goes against what you might find in church. It just is looking through a different lens, the lens of a person interested in ancient history. So that's there for you. And then finally, the last slide is about, for this module, is about scriptures. So what is the link between Jesus and the New Testament scriptures? Well, Jesus, the person, was a Jewish apocalyptic reformer. So he wanted to make changes in the society around him. He had countercultural teachings. Some of those come down to us in the Gospels. He had successful healings and exorcisms. We have lots of evidence through the texts of the New Testament that people experienced a huge change in their lives after encountering him. That's likely not all made up. It seems likely that many people were extremely convinced by him for whatever reason, experienced healing. He gathered disciples, including quite a number of women who funded his ministry, who traveled around with him in the core group, who stayed loyal to him after his death. And the earliest inner core that followed Jesus, especially the women, were the ones to bring this narrative of resurrection. His closest female disciples were the ones who said, listen, we've seen him raised from the dead. And that must have convinced quite a number of people, because look where we are today. We have a huge global religion of Christianity, where normally when the Romans kill the leader of a movement, that movement dies right there. Everyone scatters and it's over. Christianity is the only one that I know of that exploded after the leader was killed. So there's something going on there. People believed that they experienced the resurrected Jesus, and historians believe that they believed that too. But the New Testament is writings, and Jesus left no writings of his own. So there's a gap between him walking around in Galilee and between the Gospels that write about his life. So we have to realize that many decades passed between Jesus himself and the writings about him. And we have to be careful around, people didn't remember word for word. So we know that the writings are filtered through people's imaginations and memories and going from one person to another, an oral tradition and stuff like that. One thing we see in these texts, whether or not this happened during Jesus' lifetime, is that he gained the title, the Christ. That is not his last name. Christ is a political and theological Jewish title that means anointed one, chosen one, deliverer. He's definitely taken on in the New Testament the role of savior. Different New Testament books, if you read them on their own, will have a different slant though. Some will prefer to call him Son of God. Mark prefers Son of Man. John likes to call him the Word. He's called the Lamb in Revelation, Savior, Deliverer, all these different things. Paul likes to call him the Christ. Why? Studying the New Testament means studying each author's special take on things. One note for terminology, we talk about the Jesus movement during the time when Jesus was alive and shortly after. We don't call that Christianity. We don't call Jesus a Christian. We don't call Paul a Christian. We don't start using the term Christianity until around the year 100. So around the turn of the 1st century, when the separation began to happen, when the movement was more non-Jews than Jews. So in order to distinguish these two separate times, we use Jesus movement for the beginning and early Christianity for sort of the 2nd century onward. And what else is here? In the earliest parts of the New Testament, we see hints that the first followers of Jesus expected him to return very soon. So when I talked at the beginning about reading the New Testament chronologically or in the order the books were written, when we lay them out that way, we see the ones at the beginning or the ones about Jesus when he was alive, all have this idea that he's going to come back or the world will end very, very soon. But that didn't happen. And so the books written near the end of the New Testament period, the latest books that made it in, talk about that return or that end of the world, either in a very spiritualized way, almost metaphorically, or in a way that's pushed into the distant future. So those are two very different situations. And we're going to pull that apart and talk more about how does a community behave when they think they have no time left, compared to how does a community behave when they have to live together sustainably long term. And so they start to build more rules and hierarchies and systems, and all of that starts to be, an institution begins to be born when they realize we have to last a long time and things aren't ending tomorrow. Yeah. So in your reading, I made this little guideline so that it could help you as you read to sort of flag up, oh, I need to know this, I need to know that. So in your reading, look out for the origin of the term canon. It's very important for a class on scriptures. Look out for a great revision of what you've studied in the first part of the module. There's a great section that talks about Hebrew Bible, Old Testament. How are those a little bit different? Where do the Apocrypha or the Deuterocanon come in? And what are all the different kinds of early Christians? And what was their take on the different bodies of text? Look out for the section called the New Testament, some basic information. That part is excellent. It's the basics on this collection. And finally, to match the video I sent for you to watch, look out for the part about how the canon developed. I know that today the slides are filled with text, it's very dense, but this set of slides and this reading will serve you for the whole rest of the module and will slow down and parse out things more slowly for the rest of the time. This was just your crash course introduction. And finally, an important bit of housekeeping. I have unlimited cat pictures. If anyone is stressed out or for any other reason requires photos of cats, especially this cat, Sweet Pea, who's my cat right now, please just email me and I have an unlimited supply at any time. So we're just one rainbow away here from the end of the module. This is what we're going to cover together: Second Temple Judaism, the Greco-Roman world, Jesus and the Gospels, Paul's letters, letters in Paul's wake, so letters that claim to be written by Paul, but we can tell that they were actually written a lot later, Revelation and other apocalypses, the Christian Apocrypha, so all those books that didn't make it in, like some of you were asking about the Gospel of Thomas or the Gospel of Mary, all of those books we're going to look at. And finally, the Jewish Mishnah and Talmud, because the Jewish sacred scriptures don't stop at the Tanakh. They also include the rabbinic literature. So that'll be the very last class. We'll talk about rabbinic sacred texts. All right. Thanks, everyone.